Welcome. It has just gone 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Wednesday, the 17th of April, and you are watching episode 129 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap, providing an insight on the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, what is our best hope of keeping the lights on, is my guest, the Honourable Keith Pitt, the federal member for Hinkler. Keith is a member of the National Party and was first elected to represent Hinkler electorate in the Australian Parliament in September 2013 and was re-elected in 2016, 19 and 22. Keith served in the coalition government as Minister for Resources, Water and Northern Australia, and previously was Assistant Minister to the Deputy Prime Minister, Assistant to the Minister of Trade, Tourism and Investment. Keith was born and raised in Bundaberg. After finishing high school, he undertook an electrical apprenticeship and went on to study at the Queensland University of Technology, graduating with a degree of electrical engineering. Before entering politics, Keith owned a consulting and training business, including a registered training organisation, delivering vocational education and training across the east coast of the country, but in particular in rural Queensland. Keith is the former registered professional engineer in Queensland and also owned 2 cane farms in Bundaberg. He is an active member of the Hinkler community and was heavily involved in local sports such as touch football, surf lifesaving, interests which he still maintains today. Keith is married with 3 children. Welcome, Keith.
Thanks, Bill. It's quite the introduction. And how good is it to be 7 p.m. right across the East Coast and not a change of an hour somewhere else?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, we've come back to real time. I mean, actually, South Australia is the hardest one to do with that half-hour difference all around. We've had a number of conversations with people in South Australia talking about the Murray-Darling Basin and the Southern Lakes on that issue. And it continues to be an ongoing issue at the moment with the environmental buybacks from the irrigators. But our topic tonight really is centred around our energy requirements, and it's a portfolio in regards to any energy resources and water that you have, and you also have a keen interest in what's going on in the energy side of Australia. We're now committed to net zero 2050. We've got a lot of renewable targets, and of course, the areas that impacts on most is regional Australia, and regional Queensland is now starting to bear the brunt of the introduction of some of these projects, right from Cairns right down to the Southern Downs, with both wind and solar projects, along with our pumped hydro, our massive pumped hydro, as far as absorbing taxpayer money.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. And you know, even today and tomorrow, you've got the Queensland state government now having a debate about a bill to actually legislate a 75% emission reductions by 2035. No one's saying how much it'll cost or how long it'll take to get there or how they'll even achieve that. They're all trying to out-target one another, trying to get this alleged swing, green, moderate vote. I just think it's nonsense. People, at the moment, they can't pay anymore, right? We've got so many people who are living in their cars, literally. They've got jobs. I've got them here. They're in caravans, they're in tents, they're living under bridges, they're literally on roadsides, living in car parks. And it's because the cost of living is so high, even with a full-time role, they can't cover their rent and their power bill and all the other things they need to live. So something's gone massively wrong. But I'm big on numbers. So I'll give you a few numbers to start. So if we talk about agriculture in this country, there's about 425 million hectares of agricultural land that is cleared or partially cleared ag land right across Australia. And if you think about what the federal Labor government is proposing, so they've got all the stuff around renewables, and we'll come to energy in a minute, but they've also signed up to the UN position or the UNESCO position where 30% of Australia's land mass and oceans basically has to be locked up and protected. Now, you add in all of the land that's already there in national parks and everything else, there's still 60 million hectares short. So somehow the current federal Labor government is going to take 60 million hectares, and it's got to come from ag land, there's nowhere else, and basically lock it up like a national park to meet this target that they've agreed to with an international treaty. Then you add on a couple of million hectares of solar panels and wind turbines and all the surrounding areas that go with it. It's just out of control. I mean, what's wrong with having ag land that you produce food, that you feed Australians and the world with what's a top quality product? And I think people are really starting to wake up now. When you see what are literally oceans of solar panels and forests of wind turbines, I don't want to see that. And there's no need for it. There really isn't. And I'm sure we'll get to nuclear as we talk a little bit later, Bill, but really simply, it's small footprint. It works all of the time. It's got a very, very low environmental impact compared to wind and solar. And ultimately, what will you do with the waste from all these panels and wind turbines? They only last about 20 years. It's less than 20% of a solar panel that can be recycled. It's typically just the glass and the aluminium. And the forecast, and I've got this from the Parliamentary Library on wind turbines. So wind turbine blades alone around the world, would you believe we'll have 43 million tonne of turbine blade waste by 2050?
Well, that really doesn't surprise me. I mean, we can see from the United States experience where they've already started to decommission wind farms. Their original intention was we'll transport them somewhere and we'll grind them up and recycle or whatever. I think there was supposed to be a big plant down in Texas that was supposed to be doing this, and it never eventuated. So states that got in early up in the northern belt, in the cornfield belts and things like that, their wind turbines have expired and they've been dismantled, and they have to go to landfill. Now,
yep.
I cannot,
Texas hole in the ground.
cannot not imagine digging the hole for turbine blades. I mean, there are massive things. I mean, they do chop them up a little bit, but that's about furs, but it's still a massive hole, and it's a massive imposition on again land usage. I mean, all right, you used to have a tip, for your general waste, but now imagine the tip you need to take all these things, how much land it's got. And it's not as though you can use the land once they're buried there.
Yeah, and don't forget, you've got 800 tonne odd of concrete in the base. That's without the actual turbine post itself. So you've got an enormous amount of concrete. You've got a whole heap of carbon fibre, none of which can be recycled. And they're dotted all over farmers' farms. And in a lot of occasions, if you get a look at the agreements they've signed, they end up being responsible for their removal. And then you do it every 20 years. And where do they come from? They come from China. The idea that this country will rely on, firstly, its energy security from something which is inherently intermittent, right? It's intermittent, it's unreliable, it relies on the weather. And then the manufacture and supply from China, it makes our country weaker, not stronger. And this is a time where our nation needs to be strong. We need more manufacturing onshore. We need more sovereign capability. We need more affordable and reliable electricity and gas, which, across the country, you've got state governments in particular. Victoria's a great example. They've got a moratorium on gas, would you believe? No gas development down there, unconventional. That's been in place for more than 10 years. And guess what? You're running out of gas, and I think the Bass Strait, the main supply, will have dropped by 30% below demand by 2025, 26. That's going to have an enormous impact.
But we're being saved by Twiggy Forrest. He's building a import terminal for natural gas. But it all boils down, not only are we losing our energy security, we are risking our national security going down this pathway. Correct. And I think that's something we need to highlight a lot more. You cannot afford to subject yourself to a supply chain that is dubious by the means of A, the supplier is not necessarily a friendly country, and then B, it's such a long distance across the sea for supplies.
And not only that, look at natural events. I mean, in Queensland, I'm a Queenslander, proudly. I've heard we have these things called cyclones built, and there's a thing called the monsoon. Imagine what your energy output is from solar panels if the monsoon runs for half a dozen weeks, or you get a big Cat 5 cyclone that tears through there and destroys them. You then have zero output, not 20% output. And how do you replace them, and what do you do with it afterwards? So our energy security is a big part of our national security, as is water security. And this concept that Australia as an island nation can just rely on others who are going to be super friendly and continue to provide us with whatever we need, whenever you want it. We only have to look at what happened in COVID. It became who had the biggest order and who had the biggest checkbook. They got served first, and the rest of us had to wait. So I think in terms of energy security, water security, we should be absolutely sovereign. We should have that capability in this country. And it is one of the reasons that the coalition, and I've been pushing this barrow for a number of years now, think that nuclear is a good option. It's reliable. We are getting that industry anyway. Federal Labor has signed up to AUKUS. So if we're going to have over here, Virginia-class submarines, nuclear submarines, which have a nuclear reactor, which will run for 30 years, but produce high-level radioactive waste, and we'll have an entire sovereign capability in terms of nuclear technological capacity, all of the smart people, all the stuff that you need to make that happen. We're going to build submarines in Australia, and we're going to put them under the ocean to a depth of a couple of 100 metres with all of this technology on board and a nuclear reactor, but we can't take one and put it on a block of concrete in what is one of the most stable countries in the world to make steam. Right? That's all it is. It's just a big kettle that boils steam very efficiently, very effectively, and it's just mad. You have to have all the parts anyway. So why wouldn't you use it for Australia's interests?
I think the other thing there is a lot of people think of nuclear reactors as something magical for producing energy, but really the nuclear reactor is only replacing the firebox.
That's it.
In a coal-fired power station. You still need the rest of infrastructure. You need the interconnecting steam system. You need the turbines. You need the transmission system, and that. So it's a very high tech firebox.
Yep. And you need the same people, Bill. All right, same people. People on turbines, same people on generators, same people on transformers.
But some of the things that I worry about is these people who work in these places are members of the CFMEU, members which supports the Labor Party, and that renewables is putting them out. It's going to put them out of a job. So it beggars belief that they don't wake up and say, well, maybe I'd like to keep my good $200,000 a year job, and I want a job there for my son and other relatives and the next generation, rather than unemployment on the vagary of I'll be able to go out and mow a solar farm and get bloody basic wage.
Well, I was doing roadsides this week in the electorate, so we sort of get around as much as we can. I sort of 4 or 5 a day, short, sharp, half an hour at each location. And I had a guy come up to me literally, and I won't name him or name where he works, but he works in the coal industry at a coal mine producing thermal coal. And guess what? He doesn't want to go and get a job installing solar panels. And I can understand that. He's highly skilled, highly technically skilled. He's been doing drive in, drive out and FIFO for years. Now, they've done the hard yards in order to get themselves ahead. And why would you want to give that up to go back to washing down solar panels in the future, or in fact, maybe tearing them down and breaking them down in terms of recycling, when you just don't have to? You literally don't. There's plenty of technology out there, even for coal plants. High efficiency, low emission coal-fired turbines. You've got them now, right? Kogan Creek is one of those already. If you add that into CCS or offsets, well, you can get your emissions reduced to sort of 95% of what they were. So what's wrong with that? And in my view, absolutely nothing. The taxpayer owns those assets in Queensland, right? They own Kogan Creek and they own Stanwell and they own many of the others. 70% of the generators are owned by the state government. And they have long-term coal contracts where the coal costs $25, $26 a tonne, right? The idea that these things are costing an absolute fortune to run is nonsense. It is absolute nonsense. The reality is the state Labor government are hooking over $1 billion a year out of the electricity industry, goes into Treasury, and that's what they want to keep. They want to keep the taxpayer and the electricity user paying because they make a whole lot of coin out of it to run off and do the other crazy things they want to do.
Well, that sort of beggars belief in regards to why they're so interested in pushing wind and solar that's basically foreign owned, or we have a subsidiary of a foreign owned company running it. The other scary part, of course, is when they get to 18 years old and they're due for decommissioning, are those people still going to be around to pick up the bill for the decommissioning? Not sure. But like I say, at the moment, the system we've got provides a great benefit to the people of Queensland, but the new system of renewables is actually weighed in favour of the suppliers from overseas. It doesn't make sense.
I can give you a hot tip. I've actually had some research done in recent weeks. Only got it yesterday. I haven't got through the lot. But I asked the Parliamentary Library to put together for me the top 10 recipients of renewable energy certificates. So these are the RECs. So basically, this is the stuff where they get paid when they generate, regardless of what they get for the electricity. This is their ability to bid into the national electricity market at zero or negative numbers because they still get paid for RECs anyway. The top 10 providers, I looked at the first couple. The first one has made over $300 million over the last 10 years in renewable energy certificates alone. And the owner, well, the part owner is Squadron Energy. The second down the list is owned by Goldwind, who happen to be the Chinese investment company. And I haven't got through the rest yet, but I will over coming days. And this is the thing, right? So they are subsidised on the way in. They are subsidised while they're there and operating to make them competitive. They're subsidised on the way out because the taxpayer is looking after all of that, because the purchaser, particularly in Queensland, is nearly always a company called CleanCo. Now, guess who owns CleanCo? You do, the taxpayer. It's a government-owned corporation. So the Commonwealth, the feds are pouring money into the front end. And, you know, Mr. Albanese has just announced he's going to subsidise solar panel production as well. So you'll be subsidising the construction, the production, the inputs, the subsidy on operation, and you're buying it. What a guaranteed rate of return. And I can tell you, all the people who are investing in this stuff, they're not there for their environmental credentials or because it makes them feel good or it's wonderful for the planet. It's because they make money, a lot of money, and it's guaranteed by the taxpayer, and it is guaranteed by each and every one of you, by the Commonwealth government, and in many cases, the state government. And that is why they are in the game. It is not about affordable, reliable energy for them whatsoever. And I think a big mistake was made, particularly in Victoria and New South Wales, where they sold all of their assets. Now, Queensland, we can escape that. We've got a lot of good coal-fired power station assets with a lot of life left in them. But you've got these things like what's going through the state government's parliament today, a 75% reduction in emissions by 2035. Well, at a simple level, that means 75% of your coal-fired generators have to be gone. 75% of your ag-producing emissions have to be gone. 75% of your vehicle emissions have to be gone. Now, how do you do that? You can't replace all those fleets in under 10 years. Are they just going to cancel them? Do they just take them off the rail? I don't know. But I can guarantee you it is going to cost every single person an absolute fortune that they can't afford, and it will make our country weaker.
Well, certainly drive people into poverty. I mean, we're already got signs of energy poverty, and that will continue across the whole board, because if any one factor adds to costs, it has to be electricity. Electricity goes up, it just goes up across the whole sector. And it's quite interesting, back in before 2007, the price in the CPI for the general basket of goods versus the cost of electricity, the electricity costs ran underneath the general cost of CPI. Then in 2017, when we started to sign up to the Copenhagen Agreement and things like that and started introducing renewable energy targets, that's when we started to divert from the general CPI higher, and it continued at a rapid rate of going higher than the general CPI. And the only time it ever got sort of brought back or turned back at it was the first couple of years that the Abbott government came in and put the squeeze on renewables and some of the institutions that were delivering them. But then, of course, when Abbott went, we went to Turnbull, and it just continued to separate from the general CPI. But we also realised that a number of businesses have left the country over that time simply because the cost of electricity has become too prohibitive for their operation.
And you look at the news today, if I remember correctly, Qenos, the big producer from gas, has gone into administration. Now that is a real problem. If you look at not only self-sufficiency, but the things you need in everyday life, whether it's gas that's producing fertilizer, whether it's producing plastics, it's the feedstock for so many things. And if you are not competitive on your energy price, they simply can't remain here. They will leave. And the US, they're paying $2 to $4 a gigajoule for gas. That's why we've lost a lot of our manufacturing. The nickel industry in WA in all sorts of trouble because it's energy intensive. And no matter where you look, you can't subsidise every single industry out of trouble. So Mr. Albanese is going to handpick what's inside the green dream, and they'll be fine. But what's wrong with the people who are working in the galvanising plant or the foundry, or they're down at the spray painting booth, or they're manufacturing whatever, pick a product? Where's their competitive advantage? Why shouldn't they keep their jobs? Why is it their jobs will have to go offshore? Because you've got a federal Labor government that's just focused on ideologies instead of the reality of the world. I want all businesses to have an opportunity, Bill. And to do that, you've got to have affordable, reliable energy, particularly electricity and gas. You've got to have a readily available workforce. It's got the skills that you need, and you need stability. And right now, all of those industries are being told, we don't want you here. We're going to make sure you're uncompetitive. And mate, not only that, then you add on things like the nature positive plan, the safeguard mechanism, right? All of these policies that add enormous amounts of cost to being in business in this country. And guess what? They close and they leave. And that is a detriment to this country and the people that live here.
I think one of the other things is if you look at our energy system previously under the coal, it was fairly cheap in regards to its initial capital cost. It was fairly cheap to run in regards to fuel costs because most of them were either built on top of coal fields and had agreements basically that was only the cost of extraction that they were paying for. They weren't paying the export dollar price. If you look at Lorne and Hazelwood down in Victoria, they were on great big brown coal fields, and they owned it all. They just simply dug it up and put it into the boiler. Of course, it's a bit dirty.
And it's shallow.
And it was shallow. But so overall, compared to a total economy, the infrastructure and delivery of electricity was a small percent. But now under this regime, we're looking at electricity, both delivery and generation, now being a major part of our whole cost and our whole industrial system. That is completely counterproductive.
Well, it's right. And I spoke to a lady today. She's got a small business. She lives they're basically in a small, let's call it a fishing village for a want of a better term. She's the only shop in town. They're on the end of a swirl line, which is not great. She does, coffees, the fridges, the freezers. She has the basic food supply. Think about it. It's not an IGA, but think about a little IGA, a little spa in one of these communities. She said her power bill per quarter has gone to $9,000, $9,500, right? So that's almost 40 grand a year just in electricity costs that you've got to recover from a small turnover store. Right? These are massive increases. And then you apply that, as you've said, across the board, whether it's in manufacturing, whether it's residences, whether it's hospitals, whether it's aged care, it drives up the cost of everything. You look at the supply chain for agriculture. So if you're doing irrigated ag, It means that your irrigated agriculture cost is up because your pumping costs are up by more than 30% in many cases. Then you've got to refrigerate it. Then you have cold transport. Then you've got cold storage. Then you've got all the other things that go with it. And every time the power price goes up, the price of your food goes up. The fundamentals are just wrong in this approach. We are an energy-rich country. We have every single thing you could possibly think of. And guess what we're doing with it at the moment? We are selling it to everyone else because they know how big an advantage it is. And it's been a great boon for Queensland and WA and New South Wales and others. And we've got countries like Japan that rely on our resources sector literally to keep their lights on. In COVID, excuse me. So I was the Minister for Resources during COVID. And with all of the problems we had internally, you imagine what it's like if you are an energy-intensive country like Japan or South Korea, and you have to rely on your trading partners for that supply, whether it's gas or coal or others. And if that supply chain fails, your country literally runs out of energy. It just stops. Everything stops. There is no power. Now, we managed to make sure we kept the industry operational. We kept our supply chains operational. We met contracts that our nation had signed up to. And without it, those countries would have been in absolute anarchy. And I've always been very appreciative of the work that the resources sector has done. And I mean the people who are out there in their steel cap boots and their high-vis clothes, because I got to tell you, they did it pretty tough for a long time. They were away from their families literally for months at a time. Some of them for up to a year, because you had all these crazy state rules. They couldn't cross back. They couldn't fly in, fly out. They couldn't see anyone. They all had to be accommodated in different locations. But it was a remarkable effort, and they kept our country operational and a number of others. And what do we got now? Well, under the federal Labor government, our reputation is simply in tatters. You have Japan saying that sovereign risk now occurs in this country. That's just, it's incredible. It is a terrible reflection on the federal government that any country would think there is sovereign risk in investing here, and there shouldn't be.
I think the other thing in COVID with the resources, the most important thing, it actually kept money coming into the country. I mean, with all due respect, without iron ore and coal propping up this country, we would be basically a very impoverished nation. And people don't seem to understand that, and they accept these ideologues crucifying primary industries, mining, gas, and minerals. It's strange that we don't have a better defence of these people in regards to people championing. We have tons of people championing the hue and cry of the doomsday as far as climate change, but we don't seem to have the champions, even the people who are making money and billions of dollars out of these industries, standing up for them. They seem to be quite happy to place themselves in the virtue signaling arena, that they've got to save the planet from carbon dioxide.
Well, I can tell you, it's a pretty lonely field to champion at times, but I continue to do it because it matters. But I can give you some actual numbers. So if you look at COVID, the resources sector's contribution literally collapsed to a smidge under $250 billion for the year. Right, that's a long way back, but it's nowhere near. It used to only be $70 billion, right? The most recent figures I can recall is $460 billion plus into our economy. Right, $460 billion. It's like 25% of the entire GDP comes from the resources sector, and in fact, coal was the biggest export commodity for a year, bigger than iron ore. Gas hit, I think, $70 billion. Right, it was just an extraordinary boon for Australia, for the people who work in the industry, and of course for Treasury. And if you want to know how Jim Chalmers ended up with a budget surplus, well, there's two things. He added on the value of the future fund, which had never been done before, and he had rivers of gold from the hard work of the people in the resources sector at a level that had never been seen before. Record levels of production, record levels of contribution to the economy, and all of that flowed into state and federal coffers. And as a result, wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, back in the black. Now, I think he's going to find it a lot more difficult if the iron ore price continues to come back, and if they continue to attack the sectors that give us our wealth and don't utilise them for our own benefit. If you look at the royalty tax in Queensland, for example, that is the highest coal tax in the world. Nowhere has a higher taxation rate than Queensland on coal. And as a result, you saw BMA sell 2 mines. Now that's gone to Whitehaven, and I'm very pleased an Australian company has bought them, and they'll keep that operational, and those jobs will stay. I think that's great. But there's also been a couple of big projects already cancelled. You've seen the Environmental Defenders Office, and I'm not sure if you know this one, Bill. Your good mates at the Environmental Defenders Office, you fund them. The taxpayer gives them a couple of $1 million a year, and I think they gave them $9 million in the first budget from the federal Labor government to go out and try and stop projects that give Australians jobs. So they attacked the Barossa offshore, the Santos gas project up off the Northern Territory, and successfully held that up for months. That cost an absolute fortune. Now it's almost back on track. They're attacking Scarborough, which is one of the biggest offshore proposals. It's about $15 billion worth offshore gas. And I think from memory, their claim is on a thing called whale songlines. Well, who knew?
That's the new one. No one ever knew that one.
Never heard of it.
One woman suddenly piped up and says, "This is a thing."
Never heard of it. And I'll give you the consequences.
And it beggars belief.
So I'll give you the consequences, Bill. So Barossa, if you don't do the Barossa offshore projects, Northern Territory, the Darwin LNG processing facility has no backfill. Now, Barossa gives it 20 years life extension, 600 jobs. And in Scarborough, if you're not doing Scarborough and others that are off the northwest shelf, well, Pluto and all the other LNG processing facilities that are up in the Pilbara, well, you don't need those either, all right? So gas is it's something that is consumed and depletes, and you have to replace it, maintain it. Otherwise, you lose all those jobs and you lose all those supply chains. And that is exactly what the Environmental Defenders Office is trying to do, right? If they shut down the project, they shut down the entire gas industry. We lose our reputation, and our international trading partners don't buy from us. They'll go to the United States, they'll go to Canada, they'll go to Qatar, Saudis, anywhere where they can get a guaranteed supply, because without energy, what have they got? The lights go out.
Just going back there to the coal royalties in Queensland, I think that was the first time Japan's ambassador has stood up in front of the public arena and sort of said to Australia, "Oh, if you just put it in layman's terms, are you people idiots? You know, because you're endangering yourself and you're endangering your investment supply line." But what beggars belief is why a government chooses to go on a course to actually smash its own nation. And that's what it looks like to me. You're talking about the Environmental Defenders Office. The funding of that in Western Australia ended the logging in native forests prematurely. And of course, Uncle Dan down in Victoria, he wasn't to be outdone. He closed down logging down there. Now, we don't rape and pillage our native forests. We manage them. My father was a forester in Western Australia in the southwest in Northcliffe, going back into the 1940s. And you would go down to a lot of that area and stand there in a place that was logged 30 or 40 years ago, and you wouldn't even know it was logged. But these people have just got this mindset, you can't touch trees. I mean, it's just ridiculous. How has the public been convinced by this phenomena of environmentalists saying something and they believe it, despite people who have a history of delivering industry for generations being ignored?
Well, I mean, the greatest renewable product in the world, bar none, is timber. It genuinely is. I mean, we should have enormous amounts of managed timber systems. There's nothing wrong with hardwood logging. Like you, my father was a timber cutter, but his were for 96 sleepers and all those sorts of things, which kept me out of trouble when I was younger. And this is the reality of the world. As you've said, they go on a 30-year rotation. They manage the forestry incredibly well. And yet now what you have is lockouts, and it turns into a haven for feral pigs and dogs and feral cats. No one really manages it anymore. and we lose what is a critical asset, particularly if you want to build, guess what? Houses. And if you want to build cheap and affordable houses in Australia, well, you'll need a source of timber. We've also lost the only remaining paper mill we've had. It's gone now as a result of this. And what's been happening, I'm not sure if you've seen any of this, Bill, particularly the southern states, a lot of the product, particularly the strip product, was off to China. So they'd be loaded as logs onto a ship, they'd be sent to China for processing, and then we'd buy them back. I mean, where does this nonsense come from? But you're right, the Greens are unfortunately well funded, and a lot of it is international money. They have all sorts of organisations and groups which are well linked up. It's highly coordinated. The messaging is highly coordinated. They show up to everything. Every committee you can think of, every time there's a roundtable or a conference, they'll have somebody there, and they'll have a dozen of them, all making the same complaint, even though it's complete nonsense. And unfortunately, the people who I'll say, our side, they're too busy out working and employing people and getting things done in their business to show up to these committee hearings, and they're not funded by international activists who want particular outcomes in Australia. And I think that's very, very unfortunate. And mate, I'm going to be a little bit harsh on some of my colleagues. We've got too many people in the parliament now who have never had a job. They've worked on the public purse. They've always worked in an MP's office or a minister's office or any of these sorts of things. They don't know what it is to go out and risk their own home and have a mortgage and run a business and worry every single week about how you're going to make wages. And they seem to have this idea that business has this unending bucket of money. They just make so much money and profits are enormous. It's just not the case. I was in business for a long time. And you're not making extraordinary amounts of money. You're just trying to survive. And I was always very happy to be able to pay the wages of my staff. And that was always my priority. And there was a lot of times they never knew that I never got paid because I needed the money to pay them. And that happens a lot of times in business. And without business, we have nobody that's been employed. So I think, once again, federal Labor's got this wrong across the board, whether it's management of forestry, whether it's the timber industry, whether it's resources. They'll say over here we're a great supporter, but over this side, they're funding the people who are shutting them down. Right? You can't talk out of both sides of your mouth.
Just with your counterparts, especially in the Liberal Party, and I find it a bit. I mean, I come from originally in Western Australia. Joined the Air Force, was in the Air Force for 24 years and travelled around and only ended up in Queensland about 12 years ago. But you've got this funny system here in regards to you've got the LNP. You don't have a National Land and a Liberal Party separate. They were merged in 2008. You nominate yourself as a national. How does this sort of system work in regards to? Of course, you're in the federal sphere, but it's also in the state system. How do you self-identify as a national sort of thing?
well, the state level, it's just the LNP. And you're right, it's this bit of a hybrid, which, to be honest, I had nothing to do with. I joined the party in 2012. And I don't get to elect. Basically, I'm told that's where you're going in this seat, which I think is interesting. And in quite a strange anomaly, every single person in the Liberal National Party, whether they sit with the Nats or not, are actually card-carrying members of the Liberal Party. And that's how the party was structured. And once again, that's got nothing to do with me. It's just how it we all hold hands, sing Kumbaya. We all get on pretty well, to be honest, in Queensland. And then we get down there and break into our little counterparts. And every now and again, we'll have a disagreement. But I think, in my view, and I think, I'm sure for many of your listeners and viewers, the coalition has worked incredibly well for decades, and for a very genuine reason. Because if you look at the Nats, their sole job is to represent the regional parts of the country, and that tends to be the wealth. Right? That is where our wealth comes from, and we need people to live in the regions to produce it. The Liberal Party is, predominantly in the city, and yes, they have a number of regional members who are very good. I got a lot of time for people like Rowan Ramsey and Tony Passon in South Australia, for example, where the Nats don't hold any seats. But ultimately, we can be quite pure for regional Australia and say, well, hang on a minute, that the impact of this policy is so detrimental to us that we will simply oppose it. And in government, we will not support what you're proposing. And that happens very rarely, but it does happen. And I think the net zero debate is probably one where that was very fraught for the National Party. And this is on the record. I'm not breaking any of the party rules. It's been reported publicly many times. The vote was 1-by-1 vote to support the net zero position. It's been reported that I was opposed, and I'll tell you, I was opposed because the impact for the people I represent in terms of the cost of everyday living was just going to be too high, and I found it unacceptable, and the cost on jobs, and we are a 1% contributor to the world CO2, 1%. I just want to see our response be proportional to our contribution. And this is now being played out. Every single one of the people who are watching this podcast, if you think back not that long ago to when the coalition was in government, are you better off or worse off now? And I think every single one of them, in terms of their finances, their power bills, their ability to pay their rent, to just survive, tax rates, they are worse off in all of them. And that is solely because of federal Labor policies.
I think one of the other things that's going on too is the massive increase in population in Australia and its concentration in the capital cities. We're now at the state where there's more and more seats being allocated to southeast Queensland, New South Wales, that Newcastle, Sydney and Wollongong area, and Greater Melbourne is huge. And we are seeing a slow loss of representation for regional Australia. It's probably more noticeable in the state seats because, of course, if you look at Queensland, we only have about 36,000 voters for each electorate, whereas the federal system's around about the 110 to 122 or so, depending on where it is. Do you see the way things are going in regards to the influence of the city is becoming so strong that it is becoming a problem? And I'll take case in point with the federal by-election in Cook and the way that was run. You had a very safe Liberal seat. It's runs about 68% of the primary vote almost, or the two-poll prefer. The Labor didn't even contest it. And you would think a safe seat like that would be an ideal breeding ground for your own crop of candidates. You would have someone there because it's a safe seat. You've got fairly good branches in that. Yet they parachuted a failed person in from the other side, northern Sydney side, into that seat. And to beg a belief, the guy his prime job is in the renewables and carbon reduction industry. I can't see a worse mix in regards to the people's needs in the regions versus what's happening in the cities.
Oh, well, I guess a couple of things. I gave up a long time ago trying to understand how the New South Wales Liberal factional system works, right? I don't know. It's not my thing. It's not for me to tell them how they may or may not run their state, because if they came to Queensland to tell us, I'm pretty sure you know what we would say. So, look, good luck to him, and I hope he makes a good contribution in the Parliament. In terms of the way that the Constitution establishes, seats and size and everything else, there's a very strict formula. It's just pure maths, but it does have a bit of a delay. So New South Wales is actually about to lose a federal seat in the next 2 weeks. So is Victoria, because the change in population at the time the assessment was done had reduced. And overall, we're going to have less seats in the federal parliament than we do now. It's going to drop by 1 to 150. So there'll be 2 losses, New South Wales, Victoria, and 1 gain, which is in WA. And Queensland was just short of getting an additional seat. Now, given the influx that we've had recently, there's no way it'll stay that way at the next review. And I'm not sure if you saw the news today. There's media reports today that in the month of February, we had the highest level of immigration ever achieved in this country in 1 month, and it was 100 and something thousand in 4 weeks. Now, if you maintain that, that's over 1 million people a year that are just coming to this country as new immigrants. So there was already 900,000 in 18 months. And in 2 years' time, they're able to do all the things that a citizen can do, is my understanding. And guess what? They're all in the cities. And this is one of the great benefits of the National Party. The fact that we generally have a controlling number in the House of Representatives. So, for example, you don't form government without the Nats. And that means if something comes along which we absolutely cannot support, then we have the option, and it's a nuclear option, for want of a better word, to simply say no. Now, generally, the way I see that dealt with previously under good leaders like Warren Truss, for example, it'd just be done quietly. You'd literally just roll around and he'd say to the Prime Minister, he'd say, I'm sorry, Prime Minister, but I cannot support this, and neither will my party, and we won't be doing it. And it'd just disappear. It was that easy. It took a fair bit of pain, and it was very, very rare and very rarely used, and generally we could negotiate an outcome. But that is the advantage of the coalition. Whereas in Labor, the members don't even get a say, right? They are instructed how to vote. And this is one of the great differentials between my side, the Conservative side of politics, and the Labor Party. The Labor Party are always unified because their members are not allowed to do anything else other than what they are instructed. And if they do, they are immediately disendorsed and they're removed. So you never see a breakout in the Labor Party because they lose their seat. On our side, we believe in democracy. We believe in the people's right to put their view forward, to make their case. And yep, sure, there'll be some form of unhappiness, potential penalty, all those sorts of things. But I think that freedom is far more important than just this idea that we're all unified around whatever the idea is that maybe one individual has come up with. So I think that in terms of democracy, it works better on our side than under Labor. Yep, sure, sometimes we can look a bit untidy, but the reality is I wouldn't have it any other way.
I suppose it's interesting in regards to the way our forefathers wrote the Constitution. They probably never planned for mass immigration because it basically works out as under the current system of 12 senators for each of the founding states. It's that 72, you multiply it by 2 because the lower house has to have at least about twice as many seats as the Senate. So that's 144. And you divide that 144 into the population, not the number of voters, whereas seats are allocated by, they try to divide them up so you've got 122,000
for me right now.
Well, some states better, like Tasmania, they only need about 70,000.
Well, for a senator down there, they don't even need that. They should know them all by name.
That's it, yeah. And the thing is, that's why you sometimes get this odd thing, like you're saying, we're going to go from 151 back down to 150. Well, the 150 is basically comes from the two for ATC and 2 for the NT that
Northern
we never
Territory
had before. And the other interesting factor is you get a seat as long as you've got more than 4.5 population quotas. So you can have a couple of states that got more than half of a population quota and they get a seat. But then if it falls under that, they lose that seat. So this is the vagaries of that number. But overall, we have a general situation where the House of Representatives is basically twice that of the Senate.
Yeah, so 76 to win. That's the main number to remember. You want to form government, you need 76.
Well, just going back to our original conversation.
Yeah, of course.
One of the things about renewables and that, it still strikes me is that we've never had a real discussion from the government or points from the government of the cost, and it's not that hard to work out what the cost of generation to replace a gigawatt of baseload power. Of course, one of the new factors that come into it to massively increase the cost is transmission lines, because if you have 200, 300, 400 projects, they've got to be interconnected with high voltage transmission lines. And one of the big rubs about these transmission lines, the public has to pay for them and deliver those providers with a profit or monies to cover their costs and that plus a set profit, even if there's no power fed down those lines. And so that's a massive impost on the Australian economy. and we can't really figure out those costs until we know where the projects are and how many kilometres and that. But we do know, and we all have always known roughly what a gigawatt, or what it costs to replace a gigawatt of baseload power with either wind or solar. And I'll just put up a screen share here. This is a layman's guide to replacing a gigawatt of baseload power, and this goes back to a 2018 document by the Keenan Institute. I think they're in West Virginia, and they basically, their general formula for the optimum for wind is you need to build at least 4.05 gigawatts of nameplate wind generation to replace a gigawatt of baseload power.
Yep, that's about right, 33%. Yep.
But then to make it baseload, you need to back it up with 10 gigawatt hours of batteries, either hydro or batteries or whatever. So the overall cost, it's quite simple when you look at the examples that we got. The Cooper Gap wind farm cost us $850 million. It's got 123 wind turbines, 3.75, which were the largest at the time. So you need 9 of them to replace one gigawatt of baseload power, which isn't even big as Stanwell. Stanwell is about 1.4 gigawatts. Yep. So you got to spend $7.65 billion just in wind turbines, and you've got to cover an area. Well, Cooper's Gap is 102 square kilometres, so you've got to do that 9 times over, and then you've got to interconnect them.
Yep.
But then for the batteries,
don't forget though, Bill, that the 10 gigawatt hours is only basically 10 hours at 1 gigawatt. So if you've got no wind for longer than 10 hours, you're blacked out.
Yeah. What the Keenan Institute was working on, that there's a number of suppliers over various area. This is just a general optimum, and the cost of the batteries is equivalent to 52 Hornsdale power reserves, and that's the cost of 8.95 billion. So the optimum is will cost you $16.6 billion. But
for 1,000 megawatts.
Yeah, for 1 megawatt of baseload power. But that's at the best conditions sort of thing. And it obviously doesn't allow for wind droughts and things like that, which is another factor. But we can see what the general you can get a gigawatt of new coal-fired power station around about $2 billion.
And that's Healy. Yep.
So it beggars belief, you're on 1 gigawatt of unreliable power, you could actually almost replace the entire peak load requirements for Queensland in that one thing. But the thing is, for Queensland, we've got to do that 9 times over to give us the 9 gigawatts of peak power. And then when you're talking about Australia's the national grid, you're talking around about the 40 gigawatts of base load power requirements. That is massive. And then if you look at solar, that actually comes up to about $23 billion per gigawatt. I mean, anyone in their right mind, if you're doing a cost benefit analysis, why would you do it? I mean, if you were a commercial operation and you have to deliver all that yourself and get a return on it, would you do it?
Well, plus transmission, plus all the problems with easements, plus land, plus all the environmental approvals, plus all the damage to koala habitat and all the other things that are actually quite important. So the cost is just extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. And if you want to look at a quick comparison, and this is just one I know roughly. So South Korea, 4 of the APR 1400 nuclear reactors over there generates about 5,500 megawatts roughly, so 5.5 gigawatts for 22 billion US. It works all of the time. You don't need batteries. It ramps up and down on demand. And then when you get to the end of your life cycle for proposals on wind turbines and battery backup, what are you going to do with 10 gigawatt hours of lithium batteries that burn at 2000 degrees Celsius if they happen to catch on fire? And you've seen the ones in Australia, they've already had fires and they burn for a week. There's no way to manage them. I mean, the idea that these things are environmentally friendly is just farcical. They are not. So you're right on the money. And if it's about cost, and it should be about cost and reliability, you would never build a network that looks like this. And it's one of the reasons I've fought this stuff for more than a decade. And mate, I've got to tell you, I've had conversations with colleagues who'd come up and say, well, you're wrong. And I'd say, well, hang on a minute. I used to get paid to do this, right? For a living. This is what I used to do. Oh, no, that's not right. Because, somebody's come and told me that, what we need is A, B, C, D, E. And if you really want to know how that happens, follow the money. Follow the money.
Well, the other thing is the environmental lobbies obviously have a lot of sway, but then we can't convince the public, well, right, this is the argument for putting them in there, but how are we going to deal with the disposal? It doesn't seem to be an issue, which beggars belief, because we have to look at this situation. Batteries are notorious. We're probably looking at 10 years life cycle. That's a massive disposal problem because they're highly toxic. We can't just throw them in landfill. I'm not sure what we're actually going to do with them. I don't know if anyone's actually got a policy that they can say.
And local council too, right? What are they going to do with all these solar panels? They're stacking them up now. They don't know what to do with them. Every time you have a hailstorm, you lose them. Did you know that there's a new solar facility near Gympie? And I think it was somewhere around Christmas. They lost, before they came online, they lost 100,000 solar panels in a hailstorm before they generated a single thing. 100,000 panels had to be replaced. And that can happen every time you have a hailstorm. This stuff is mad. Well,
and southern Queensland, in particular, is notorious for thunderstorms and hail. Victoria is not much better, and I suppose you say, well, they're not the ideal places for these are weather event problems.
And that's without bushfires.
Bushfires, yeah. If we could just move on now to keeping the lights on. We obviously know we've got problems with renewables, not only just with the intermittency, the cost and the disposal of the after event. Although I'm still extremely worried about who's picking up the tab when they're decommissioned, especially if a lot of these things are transferred to a $2 shelf company or something. Because we do have a history where a lot of projects come on the line. There's a fairly substantial company in the first instance that puts the proposal, then it's bought by someone of a lesser integrity, and then if they're unsold, we might be losing that ability to get them to pay the decommissioning costs.
Well, that's right. And you compare what's happening inside intermittent wind and solar projects with what happens in the resources sector. Now, the resources sector, they literally hold a financial guarantee with Treasury that they will rehab their mine site. It can be cash, it can be a bank guarantee, but they must maintain that guarantee. So when it comes to the end of mine life, it's guaranteed to be rehabbed, not at the expense of the taxpayer. So I think you're right on the money, and wait until they're offshore. And they're even harder to get to in a more dangerous environment in terms of damage to the actual environment, highly corrosive area, in the ocean, and then you need very specialised equipment and technical people to remove them and install them. It will be even worse. So I think you're right on the money.
My personal bet is offshore wind will not go ahead in Australia. Basically because we're starting to realise and get figures in from overseas, the cancellation of projects on the east coast of the United States and the problems in the North Sea with maintaining them. So
Salt water's corrosive. Who knew?
maybe we will, of course, we're at least lagging that far behind. We might not go down that path because the whole people will leave that part of the market. I mean, we already see wind turbine manufacturers balking at going ahead with a lot of their projects and building and that. So maybe that's going to be our saving grace, that there's so many inherent problems that are being experienced overseas and that we just won't get the same penetration. But that does leave us with a problem. We're going down this pathway, we're closing coal-fired power stations, then suddenly we can't go ahead with the supposedly godsend of renewables. What do we do? How do we keep Keith, how do we keep the lights on?
Well, I hate to say it, but you won't. Right? That's the bottom line. You won't keep the lights on. And I think in the very near term, what will happen is state governments will have to go back to the coal sector cap in hand and pay them a whole heap of money to keep their power stations running, because without them, the whole country will collapse. And I think it's awful that we've ended up in this position. It should never have happened. And it's all about ideology from people who have no idea about physics, engineering, and economics.
And no care.
They don't care.
Don't care. I mean, if you go back to some of the instigators of this, it was the ideology, and also getting kudos from the greater worldwide community that they were going down this track, sort of thing. It is a problem when you decide that following the crowd for the international scene takes precedence over your national security and the welfare of your own people.
Well, what would you prefer to do, Bill? Would you put your family in the car to drive over a bridge designed by an engineer with 25 years experience, or designed by a political lobbyist because they want to get a particular ideological outcome? I know what I'm doing.
Well, that's it. But this is the thing. We have at least for about 20 years now a propensity not to listen to the actual experts in the field with field experience. I mean, you only have to go to things like Vegetation Management Act in Queensland. People who had 40 years experience in the field, you know, they've also had tons of times in the Department of Primary Industry and that. People like Bill Woodward, fantastic guy in regards to his knowledge of woodlands and vegetation growth. When it came to the Vegetation Management Act, people like him and his input was disregarded over that of people who had, had just had a recent university education, were plonked somewhere in either the bureaucracy or high up.
They had a feeling. They had a feeling.
So like we had the Vegetation Management Act, we had all these public consultants things, people, they all went out to Longreach, as far away as Longreach, discussed with the community, but not one word of that act was changed, regardless of the input of people like Bill Woodward and a lot of other people who had 20, 30 years experience. It basically came down to this. The original draft was written by the Australian Conservation Society, actually, taken up by the government. People like Nick Heath then penetrated into the Queensland government to become Chief of Staff with the Environmental Minister, and then is now and has been for a long time the Chief of Staff for the Premier. It makes it very hard to get a fair result for the public if you've got this sort of mentality and this power entrenched in the bureaucracy.
Well, I can tell you democracy still works, and you only have to look at what happened at the Voice referendum, where we were all told that it was going to be a yes outcome, and the pollsters all said this, and you can't oppose it. But we opposed it on the grounds that it just wasn't right for our country, and on a values proposition, and we fought for that. And we got the outcome because the Australian people agreed with us. And for every single one of your viewers, Bill, if you want politics to be different and you want things to be different, well, the world is run by those that show up. Show up, join a party, help out, put forward your views, make a contribution, and maybe we can get things to be a bit better.
Yes, we definitely got to shake the Australian public out of their apathy and sort of participate. It's gone over now, but we just want to touch on nuclear power.
Yes.
How do you think this will play out? Because I have my reservations basically in the fact that we've still got the ban on nuclear industry in general. We had a concerted effort to get a waste disposal site through. It was almost after, I think it changed sites from the original one, but somewhere in South Australia, there was community agreement, even with a lot of the Indigenous people that was required. And then suddenly some group popped out of nowhere that doesn't seem to even be related to the area and put a stick in the spoke. So if we can't get basic things like a waste facility up, how are we going to convince all the ideologues, all the conservation powers, and the general public and the politicians that are required to overturn these bans, and then hopefully let the marketplace decide what goes ahead?
Well, firstly, the moratorium's already been overturned, would you believe? But only in one location, that's in Adelaide. So the Labor Party put through a bill that lifted the moratorium in Adelaide because otherwise you can't build nuclear submarines. So that's happened. But it's not for the rest of the country.
Well, yeah, that's self-serving, isn't it? That's vested interest, but it doesn't go outside of. So that's the problem, like I say.
Yeah,
and
but
we've got to.
For the low-level waste facility, I can talk to you about that for 3 or 4 hours because I was the minister that signed it off. And it was a location at a place called Kimber in South Australia, where there was 63% community support. It took 6 years of consultation, started with 26 different sites, narrowed down to 3, then to 1. It was a location where there was no native title. So we've got no native title, community support. They want to put it there. It's a multi-$100 million facility that will give them work for their local people for literally 80 or 100 years. And it was knocked out on a review of decision by the courts after the Bangala people put up a review. And from memory, it was on the basis that I had an apprehended bias, even though I might not have been aware of it. And I actually wanted to deem the site. So the proposal was for the Parliament to make a decision to deem the site, and then none of these things can happen. Obviously, I had the numbers in the House of Reps. I thought we would have them in the Senate, and unfortunately, Pauline Hanson's team decided not to support the deeming of the site, and we didn't have the numbers in the Senate, so we couldn't do it, and Labor wouldn't support it. And that community is heartbroken about all the things they went through, and it's still there. It could be done tomorrow. The current Resources Minister, Madeleine King, who I get in with very well, could deem that site and put it into Parliament, and we can be done. And they can do that right now. Instead, I read reports this week that they're engaging a PR firm to try and find a location. There is nothing wrong with the one that's been selected. Everything is done.
Start the whole process over again and delay it for another 6-10 years. So this is my concern. We may want to get to nuclear energy, but what is strewn in the pathway for us to get down to that sort of situation? Because if we can't get over those basic sort of things, it's going to be a long slog to actually get the tick of approval to have nuclear energy generation, even if it's small modular. So what sort of time scales? After the lights go out.
I'll keep it short and simple. There'll be an enormous scare campaign from the Labor Party and every single letterbox you can think of that how horrible it is. And apparently you all get a reactor at Bondi Beach and in the middle of the suburbs. It'll all be complete nonsense. And we'll put forward a proposition that's based on engineering and economics and try and provide enough education to the Australian people for them to make an informed decision and to have a conversation about what works, and nuclear works.
And the other thing is what you've got to do is convince enough voters to give you that voting power, because especially if Labor is ideologically opposed and in line with their green counterparts. So it is definitely going to be a long process ahead. Do you think we could kick back to a situation where we are forced into coal and say, right, we just have to have coal for another generation of coal plants to get us through to when we can come up with a reliable replacement baseload power system?
Well, you'll need to extend. You'll need to extend the existing system now. There's no doubt about that. And you'll need gas. And if you aren't building those, well, the lights will go out. It's that easy. You can't build a network that is made of 80% unreliable and intermittent sources, because it will be unreliable and intermittent. It's pretty straightforward. And look, I don't know how Labor thinks they're going to get away with this, but they won't. And the moment you get a loss of a big unit, you've got Callide C out at the moment, has been for some time. Contingency, when everything was owned by the public and was run by governments, contingency used to be 20% plus. Now it's nowhere near that. And you only need one loss from a failure somewhere and you start tripping things off. And what do they trip off first? Well, it'll be coal mines, it'll be industry, and then they'll come for residences to try and keep the lights on. So, I think we're in a very precarious position, and that's no good for the country.
Do you think the people will, once they're subject to this dilemma, that they won't be able to switch their lights on when they think they can and all that sort of stuff? That will change their whole thought process and their whole attitude towards the pathway, not only of renewables, but to net zero.
The moment you lose the food in your freezer twice in a week, food that you can't afford to buy anyway, their mind will turn to it very, very sharply, and they'll let the MPs know very, very quickly, and they will change their mind very, very fast, I would suggest, because that's where we're heading, right? That's where we're heading.
Well, that's a sad scenario for a first world developed nation.
Terrible. We shouldn't be in that position. We've got enormous amounts of resources, and we should be putting them to use for the benefit of the Australian people, whether it's uranium, coal, gas, it doesn't matter. But you simply can't build a network from things that are inherently intermittent and expect it to work.
Okay, then, Keith, we'll just wind up now. If you could just give us a bit of a indication of what's ahead for you over the next, well, it's probably only 12 months to the next election or whatever. The things that you've got to focus on, A, for the Australian public, and B, for your electorate in particular.
Once the nuclear policy is launched, I'd expect, I'll get a number of inquiries about some of that. I'm not involved with the development. I'm a humble backbencher now. So hopefully they get it right, but we'll wait and see. Locally, it's all about cost of living. Cost of living. And as we've said during the program, a lot of that is tied back to power prices and gas prices. You've got enormous challenges with inflation, with interest rates. None of those things are coming off. And regardless of whether you're on the age pension or you're starting out as an apprentice or you've been at work for the last 20 years, right now, this is the most unaffordable it's been for most Australians for literally decades. And what's changed? Well, you've got a Labor government with Labor policies who are only interested in delivering their ideology. And I'll be out there publicly fighting against the things I think that are wrong. And Labor's got plenty of them. And locally continue to try and deliver some of the infrastructure that we need in a regional area. Right now, I've just lost an aged care centre at the end of last year, 50 beds, because they can't meet Labor's policy on nurses. Now, everyone would love to have nurses in every aged care facility all of the time, but you can't source them in the regions. And what do? Well, they have to close, which means we have even less facilities than we had before. So I just want to see some practicality back in decision making in Canberra, and that's been quite difficult. It's made my hair grey.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that beggars belief. They're so intransigent in regards to they're not willing to look at individual situation. These are the rules. We've got to apply them. It doesn't matter if you can do it or not do it. If you can't do it, well, then you're gone. And it just seems unrealistic. And again, a lot of those things should be farmed out further down the chain to local government or local authorities or something to manage those things and deliver those services. But I suppose the other thing that with the cost of living and even with your electorate, it's a fairly fast growing electorate because a lot of people have been coming into the country. That's provided a situation where a lot of people from Brisbane are coming up to Hervey Bay and Maryborough and that. And just south of you, Gympie is actually one of the fastest growing areas as well. So do you think the debate also that you'll have to deal with going forward is immigration, because that would have to be one of the factors adding to the inflation rate?
Well, it's getting raised with me constantly. I mean, 900,000 additional people in an 18-month period. The entire ACT is only about 550,000. You can't be bringing in effectively the capital every 6 months and expect infrastructure to keep up, whether it's roads or housing or hospitals or aged care facilities. It's just not sustainable. So Labor needs to move on that. Obviously, we'll have our own position coming in when the election shows up. But they're just fundamental realities. So I'll be fighting against what Labor's doing at the moment. As I said, more than 100,000 people in just a single month. That's just not acceptable.
I think you hit on the right word there, reality. And some people are not in touch with the reality in Canberra.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt about that.
Okay, well, look, Keith, we'll leave it there. If you could just stay on the line for a minute, I'll do an outro and introduce next week's show, and then we'll just have a quick chat.
No problems at all. Thanks so much. Good night. God bless.
All right, thanks very much for your time. If you enjoyed tonight's show, please like, share, and subscribe to our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Join us again next week when my guest will be Robert Kerry. Now, Robert Kerry is still the CEO for the North Queensland Bioenergy Project in Ingham, which has obviously stalled for some time, but there is light at the end of the tunnel going forward, and we'll talk to him in regards to the prospects and opportunities of that project, and not for just biofuels, but for the sugar industry in general. So please join us again next week. Thank you.